They thought he was just another man, just another name, just another face in the crowd. But what they didn't know is that some men don't run from danger. They walk straight into it. Watch till the end, because this isn't just a story about revenge. It's about what happens when evil makes the biggest mistake of all, choosing the wrong man. They looked at him and saw nothing. Not nothing as in invisible, no, nothing as in harmless, predictable, ordinary. The kind of man you pass on the street and forget before you even take your next step. That was their first mistake, because men like him don't announce themselves. They don't need attention. They don't walk into rooms trying to own them. They sit back, quiet, observing, listening more than they speak, watching more than they react. And people mistake silence for weakness. The Mafia did too. They ran their world on patterns, control, fear, a system built on knowing who to pressure, who to break, and who to eliminate. And when his name came across their table, it didn't raise alarms. No reputation, no noise, no visible threat. Just another man. So they treated him like one. They pushed, tested, took something that didn't belong to them, thinking there would be no consequence beyond the usual. Maybe a complaint, maybe a plea, maybe silence. But what they didn't understand was the kind of silence they were dealing with. Because there's a difference between a man who is quiet and a man who is waiting. And he had been waiting a long time. You see, underestimation doesn't just blind you, it exposes you. It makes you careless. It makes you comfortable. It makes you believe you're in control. Even when you're standing on the edge of something you don't understand. They didn't investigate deeper, didn't ask the right questions, didn't look past the surface. If they had, they would have seen it. The discipline in the way he carried himself, the control in his movements, the absence of fear where fear should have been. That kind of man doesn't come from nowhere. That kind of man is built through pain, through loss, through moments that break most people, but shape a few into something else entirely. But the Mafia, they didn't see any of that. They saw an easy target. And when you believe something is easy, you stop being careful. That's when the balance shifts. Because while they were making noise, making moves, making assumptions, he was doing something far more dangerous. He was learning. Every face, every routine, every weakness hidden behind their power. And the more they underestimated him, the more time they gave him. Time to understand them, time to prepare, time to become exactly what they never expected. See, underestimating a man like that doesn't just give him an advantage. It gives him control. Control of the pace, control of the moment, control of how the story unfolds. And by the time they realized they had misjudged him, it wasn't a realization that came with options. It came with consequences already in motion. Because the truth is, the most dangerous man isn't the loudest one in the room. It's the one you never considered dangerous at all. And once that mistake is made, it doesn't get corrected. It gets paid for. Power. It's a strange thing. Some people chase it, some people inherit it, and some misuse it so often they forget what it's supposed to mean. The Mafia, they believed power was control. Control over streets, control over fear, control over people's choices, their lives, even their silence. They built their empire on that belief, brick by brick, threat by threat, a system where respect wasn't earned, it was enforced. And for a long time, it worked. Because most people bend when pressure is applied. Most people fold when fear enters the room. That's how power survives, by making sure nobody dares to challenge it. But every system, no matter how strong, has a flaw. And their flaw was assuming everyone could be controlled. Because then, there was him. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats, didn't try to prove anything. Because he wasn't driven by power. He was driven by principle. And that's something power doesn't always understand. You see, power can be taken. Principle has to be lived. It's not something you switch on when it's convenient. It's not something you use to intimidate others. It's a line, a boundary, a code that doesn't move, no matter who stands in front of it. And he had one, clear, unshakable. There were things he would tolerate and things he wouldn't. And the moment they crossed that line, this stopped being about power. Because power would have meant negotiating. Power would have meant compromise. Power would have meant knowing when to step back and protect what you've built. But principle, Principle doesn't step back. It stands firm. Even when standing firm costs everything. That's what made him different. The Mafia expected fear. They expected hesitation. They expected him to react like everyone else they had ever dealt with. But he didn't. Because when a man lives by principle, he doesn't measure his actions by risk. He measures them by right and wrong. And once something is wrong, truly wrong, there's no discussion left to have. That's where power begins to lose its grip. Because power relies on influence. It relies on leverage. It relies on the idea that there's always something to take, something to threaten, something to control. But what happens when there's nothing left to take? What happens when the man you're trying to control has already decided what matters most? That's when power meets something it can't move, something it can't intimidate, something it can't break. And that's exactly where they found themselves. They pushed harder, applied more pressure, tried to remind him who they were, what they could do, but every move they made only proved one thing. They didn't understand him. Because you can't overpower a man who isn't playing the same game. To them it was business, strategy, control. To him, it was personal, not emotional, not reckless, but deeply rooted in something they had long forgotten: integrity. And integrity doesn't negotiate with corruption. It doesn't bow to intimidation. It doesn't look for the easiest way out. It stands, even when everything around it tells it to fall. And that's what made this collision inevitable. Power versus principle. One built on fear, the other built on truth. One that demands obedience, the other that refuses to surrender. And when those two forces meet, there's no middle ground. Revenge. Most people get it wrong. They think it's loud, emotional, explosive. A moment of anger, a loss of control, a reaction without thought. That's not what this was. This wasn't rage. This was precision. Because a man like him doesn't act when he's emotional. He acts when he's ready. And readiness takes time. While they were celebrating their dominance, moving like nothing had changed, he was doing something far more dangerous. He was slowing everything down, watching, studying, understanding. Because real retribution isn't about striking fast. It's about striking right. Every move they made, every routine they followed, every weakness they thought was hidden, it all became part of a pattern. And he saw the pattern clearly. That's what made it calculated. There was no guesswork, no randomness, no wasted motion, just a quiet, steady buildup, like pressure behind a sealed door. And the thing about pressure, it doesn't explode without warning. It builds until it's unstoppable. That's exactly what he became. Unstoppable not because he was stronger, but because he was prepared. See, chaos is easy. Anyone can act in anger. Anyone can lash out. Anyone can create noise. But calculated retribution, that requires discipline. It requires patience in moments where most people would rush, control in moments where most people would break, clarity in moments where everything feels clouded, and he had all three. That's why they never saw it coming, because they were expecting retaliation, not strategy. They were expecting noise, not silence. They were expecting a reaction, not a plan. And while they waited for something loud, something obvious, something reckless, he gave them nothing. No warnings, no signals, no indication that anything had changed. Until it did. One move, small, precise, intentional, not enough to alarm them, just enough to disrupt. And then another, and another. That's how it starts. Not with a bang, but with a shift. A slight imbalance in something that once felt solid, something they couldn't quite explain, but couldn't ignore either. Because calculated retribution doesn't attack everything at once. It isolates, breaks things down piece by piece, removes support where it matters most, creates doubt where confidence used to live. And doubt is far more dangerous than fear. Fear can be controlled. Fear can be silenced. Fear can be managed. But doubt spreads. It turns allies into questions, turns certainty into hesitation, turns strength into vulnerability. And before they even realized what was happening, their foundation started to crack. Not from the outside, but from within. That's the power of calculation. It doesn't need to overpower, it just needs to outthink. And he was always one step ahead, not because he moved faster, but because he moved smarter. Every action had a purpose. Every decision had weight. Every moment was part of something bigger. This wasn't revenge driven by emotion. This was consequence and designed with intention. A response that matched the offense, not in chaos, but in clarity. Because when a man chooses calculation over anger, he doesn't just react to what's been done. He reshapes what comes next. In the end, this was never just a story about a man. It was a lesson about what happens when power gets comfortable, when control turns into arrogance, and when people forget that not everyone is meant to be tested. Because they didn't just make a move, they made a choice to ignore the signs, to dismiss the silence, to underestimate something they didn't understand. And that choice, it changed everything. What they thought would be easy became impossible. What they thought they controlled slipped through their hands. What they thought was weakness revealed itself as something far more dangerous. Not strength, discipline, not anger, but purpose, not chaos, but calculation. And that's where they lost, because they were fighting with power eyeing while he was moving with principle. They reacted, he prepared, they assumed, he understood. And in a game like that, there's only one outcome. Not because one side was louder, not because one side had more, but because one side knew exactly what they were doing, and the other didn't even know what they were up against. That's the difference. The difference between control and mastery, between fear and respect, between making moves and making them matter. Because when you choose the wrong man, you don't just face resistance, you face consequence. A consequence that doesn't rush, doesn't warn, doesn't hesitate. It arrives exactly when it's supposed to. And by the time you see it clearly, it's already too late.